Hello, everybody. We have been discussing dual nature of nature, where initially Maxwell's electrodynamics told us that electromagnetic wave or radiation is a wave, radiation is electromagnetic wave. But later, Einstein's photoquanta or light quanta hypothesis told us that electromagnetic wave, or I should not say electromagnetic wave, rather, I should say radiation, also behaves like particles. And then we looked at Compton scattering, where both this nature was used to figure out what is happening during Compton scattering. In 1924, we learned that de Broglie made this very bold hypothesis where he said that everything in nature, particularly matter, which has an momentum p there and energy e, there is an associated wave which has wavelength lambda d and energy say d. D stands for de Broglie. So every thing in nature, particularly de Broglie is talking about matter waves. So for every matter, there is an associated wave. The wave has if the matter has a momentum p, the wave has a wavelength lambda t, and the matter has an energy ed, the wave has a wavelength omega. Okay, and we saw that for radiation, this works out quite well. We saw that we can use this to understand the Bohr's hypothesis on angular momentum. And we looked at two non-relativistic examples of de Broglie waves. One is that of a cricket ball thrown by Shoaib Akhtar, say, and he saw that the wavelength is too small for us to detect, the frequency is too large for us to detect. The other was the example of electron, where he said that if the electron is accelerated between two metal plates, giving a voltage of 56 volt, then the electron will have a kinetic energy of 56 electron volt. And then for that, the wavelength of the electron comes out to be 1.67 angstrom. And if you remember, I gave you a homework to calculate what is the frequency of that electron wave. Now this is what we learned up to last time. Today we'll see or discuss an experiment to start with, which actually found the existence of the electron waves. Remember that to find any wave, the easiest way is to see an interference phenomena. And Devision and Garmer, working at the International Business Machines, what you know as IBM, actually saw the electron waves. So let me tell you about their story a little bit. So what was happening is the following. Diffraction pattern was observed So remember, Compton used the calcite crystal as a spectrometer, and the calcite crystal has this very nice arrangement of lattice which give them two planes of which the wave will get reflected, and then you will get to see the diffraction pattern. So or the interference pattern. As we'll learn in PHY 102, that all diffractions are also interference. Sometimes they're called diffraction pattern, sometimes they're called interference pattern. It really doesn't, it's not that much of an importance right now. What you want to call, you can call it. Let me remind you of this part. That Webster interference, remember in this case, what we had was this layers of atoms arranged in a crystal in a very regular fashion, which gave us two planes, one the top plane and one the bottom plane. And of these two planes, the wave was getting reflected. In the case of Compton scattering, the X-ray spectrometer was made using this principle. So this was This type of phenomena, it was first observed and theorized by Bragg. So these are called Bragg's pattern. The interference pattern or the diffraction pattern, whatever you want to say, is called a Bragg's pattern. Okay, so let us come back to our discussion. So this was observed for crystals using X-rays. So let me just remind you of what is observed, because this will come into our understanding of Davisson-Garmer experiment also. Here I am talking about X-ray diffraction, so diffraction or interference made by X-rays bouncing off the crystals. Okay, so I'm meticulously drawing this. You will see why. I have these atoms in the crystal arranged in a very regular fashion, and let me draw one more layer such that I can get the point across to you. Okay, let me draw one more layer. Don't get bored. Okay, so that's enough for us. Now, in this particular case, I have drawn a particular type of crystal. I will not go into different types, but this is what is seen in nickel. And it's because we will be using the Davisson and Garmer use nickel. Because of that, I am just sticking to nickel here. The distance between the two planes in nickel is so this distance is what we called A, right? The distance between two planes. But you see, there is not only one pair of plane in this crystal. So one pair of plane you can define like this, right? That is what we did. But there are many such pairs of planes. I can define a plane which is like this. Just because it's a regular arrangement, I can define planes in many different ways. I can define a plane which goes like this. And you see the distance between the interplanar or the interplanar spacings for these different planes are necessarily different, right? So these interplanar spacings are all different. So these are our different A values. For each of this plane, I will see an interference pattern. So the X-ray can get reflect off any two successive planes. Okay. But for whatever A I see, so remember that let's consider one of such reflections, and for that let me make this particular plane. So let's say that our X-ray is getting reflected off this blue plane. So I should use blue color to draw thicker lines here, which will basically tell us that this is the plane I am talking about. Okay, and remember that light falls in one direction. Say light falls like this to this plane and gets reflected off. Obviously there is reflection from both the planes, two successive planes, and then there is a phase difference between those two lights as they're coming in and going out, and then you take the phase difference and you calculate the maximum. This angle is what let us call this theta today. So remember that what we saw is to A is the blue A, this A, sine of theta equals lambda, first n equals to 1, this is the condition for the maximum. Now this was seen, and this interplanar spacing of nickel was measured. So all these, once you do the X-ray diffraction, you can measure all these different A's, all the possible interplanar spacings. Okay, that's a very well-known technique used in crystallography even nowadays. There is one more technique, which is, this is called Bragg's diffraction technique. The other technique is called Lowy diffraction technique, which is exactly what Thomson used to see the waves of electron, which we'll not talk about, we'll just mention it at the end. So J.J. Thomson used that technique. Okay, so now, see, this is very early days. What people have seen, that there are this refraction phenomena happening, and they concluded that there are these planes of atoms in different orientations. And because you see many of these peaks, it also told them that there are many different planes, and that is kind of they can conclude from there that these planes are made up of these discrete crystal points, crystal positions. So this positions, and this can be one small unit of crystal sitting at that position. Now that has to be verified. So Davison and Garmer was verifying, part of IBM, as a part of IBM. Now these crystals are very useful for making electronics equipments, and that's what IBM was trying to do. So as a part of IBM, Davison and Garmer were trying to see the existence of this crystal sites. So they were trying to see this individual, if you wish, atoms or molecules, whatever is sitting over there. In this case, it's just the nickel atom, and the space in between the atoms are mostly empty. Like in this, this plane that you talk about in the Davison-Garmer experiment. So this is 0.91 angstrom, which you can see is 1 angstrom, which is say 100 times than the size of an atom. So the space between the atoms are empty. So what they wanted to do, they planned an experiment I say like Rutherford scattering. So remember what happened in Rutherford scattering? So there was this gold foil, which you can think of one of these planes, and the gold foil had this nucleus, and it was bombarded with alpha particles, and the alpha particles only gets reflected off the nucleus, and most of the alpha particle passes through. So that is what they were trying to see. So they thought that, okay, so I have these planes which may be consisting of these crystal elements, and when they bombard with the electrons, not alpha particles, most of the electrons will pass through, some of them will reflect off. Okay, so this is what they expected. This is expectation. Okay. Now, while they were doing this, while doing the experiment, I'll show you the setup shortly. But while doing the experiment, the nickel, this is supposed to be pure nickel to see this, got oxidized, which is the usual case for anything that you keep for a long time in air. So they heated it up. Now we are talking about early days still, so crystallography was not known very well. What resulted by heating this is formation of crystals. I'll say single crystal, I'll explain what it is. So if you have nickel, so the nickel is say some bulk nickel, some amount of nickel you have taken. So if you look at it carefully, nowadays you can do it using certain instruments. You will see that if you take small amount of nickel, there are these crystalline structures, but they are in very small regions like this. So everywhere there is a regular structure, but at the adjacent layers, the structure is not regular. So there is a break. Okay. So that's a multicrystalline structure. What happened once they heated up to, if you heat up, the oxygen will essentially evaporate. What when they try to do that, break the chemical bond between oxygen and nickel, then from this type of structures they form single crystals, and that was important for what they were doing or what they actually saw. It was not important for what they are doing because they actually didn't know what they're doing, but it was important for what they saw. So let me show you the setup. It is an extremely complicated setup, and there, if you look at the research paper, it's quite lengthy, but I will simplify it for you. So you have a structure which looks like this. It's essentially a cylinder, metal cylinder with a small hole in it. You may see this drawn differently in different books and different places, because all of these drawings are simplification of what Leviathan and Gamma actually used. So what I'm drawing here is a wire mesh of, say, copper. So what is that? So it's like a tea strainer where you have most of the water falls through, only the tea leaves stays. So this is also like that. It's if I look at it from the top, it will look like this essentially. Okay, and this and this is attached to a voltage divider bias. Okay, and you have a filament here. You can give it the same voltage supply or give it a different supply. What this filament does is that it hits up a small metal plate in between, and that metal plate, when it is heated up, as we discussed in an earlier lecture, it will emit electrons. So it will have thermoionic electrons, and it's just heated up such that, assume that the electrons are getting just a zero amount of kinetic energy. It has been able to come out of those metal, and you have negative charge in this, so it will get repelled. It will come towards this and eventually come out of this hole. So there is a voltage maintained here, which let us call this V, through this voltage divider bias. So I can measure this voltage here using a voltmeter. You keep the nickel over somewhere here. So this is the nickel target, over which the electrons that come out, they fall here. And then, pivoting this point, you can move a detector, the detector, one position of the detector I am drawing here. The detector also looks something like this. I will explain to you what it is. the detector has an ammeter attached to it. So this is ammeter. This is a voltmeter, obviously. Okay. This detector is called, this detector looks like this. It's a metal, usually copper cup with a very small opening. Okay. So the electrons comes through this opening. Near to the opening there is insulator. It's insulated outside. Okay. So it's insulated from outside. Insulated means electrically insulated. So if the copper falls in the electron falls in the insulator, nothing happens, but the electrons can come inside. So it gets collected inside, and then you have this ammeter attached to it, which will show certain amount of current proportional to the amount of electron collected. So the electrons get scattered off from the nickel and gets corrected by the Faraday cup. So it's called a Faraday cup. Okay. So what is happening? The electrons, as they're coming out from the metal plate, are getting accelerated by a potential difference V, potential of V. So you will agree that the amount they get, extra amount they get on acceleration is E times V, which should be equals to the kinetic energy of the electrons, and the kinetic energy is P square by 2m. Or I can write that the Pe is root over of 2me. Me is mass of electron, E charge of electron times V. Okay. And so this is what the setup is. Now what they observed. Let's talk about observation. So you see in this setup there are two control parameters. One is I can change this angle. Let us call this angle psi. So controls, one is V, which is this voltage. I can change by using the voltage divider bias. Other is psi. So these are the two control parameters. So obviously if I change both of them together, it will be very difficult to understand what is happening. So they did it one by one. So one thing they did was they changed psi and look at the current. So the measurement that you can make is this current. This current. Actually, the current direction should be opposite, but it doesn't matter. This signal is, this sign is means that it is grounded. So what they saw is a peak. So they kept the voltage in this case fixed to 54 volt, and they saw a peak at 50 degrees. Psi equals to 50 degree. So this is one set of data. The other set of data is really obvious. Now you see that there is a peak at 50 degree for 54 volt of voltage. So now you vary the voltage and look at the I, keeping psi equals 50 degree. Okay, so this is a constant. And as expected, they saw a peak now at 54 volt. Okay. So there is something interesting happening that you observe. See, what you expected, if it would have been like a Rutherford scattering, is remember that for the Rutherford scattering, the maximum amount that you see is here at the direct, once it goes I mean psi equals to 180 degrees, and then it reduces in either direction. Very few which are hitting exactly at the nucleus for the Rutherford scattering goes directly 180 degree. But here what you see is a peak at 50 degree, which is kind of interesting. And also that 50-degree peak is matched with a certain voltage through which the electrons are given a kinetic energy. Now initially they did not know about the de Broglie hypothesis. De Broglie was, and everything else was in Europe, and they were in United States of America, and there was a sea called Atlantic Ocean in between them, and there was no internet at those times. So they did not know about de Broglie hypothesis for a long time. But then when they come to know, so they realized what is happening. So let us see what can be the explanation. You see, let's assume that what we are looking at through de Broglie hypothesis is the matter wave or waves of electron. Let's assume matter waves or the Broglie waves. Okay. So what will be the wavelength of this wave? Well, we discussed it earlier. I can get the wavelength of the de Broglie wave if there is this type of crystal diffraction happening. So you see, this is exactly what is happening in our setup also, the Division and Gamma setup also. The electrons are coming in, they're deflecting off from some parallel plane and then going off in other direction. So this is the angle that they call psi. And you will agree that if I want to get theta from psi, psi by 2 is the incident angle, same is the reflected angle. If I do 90 degree minus psi by 2, what I get is theta, which is this grazing angle as we defined earlier. It's clear from this geometry, right? So let me draw that again once again here. So the electrons are coming in this way, they're getting reflected off some plane here, and we call this angle psi, and that is related to the grazing angle theta by psi by 2, 90 degree minus that is equals to theta. So if de Broglie hypothesis is correct, so lambda d then will be 2a sine of theta. 2, as we said, then for the nickel, there's interplanar spacing available, which is 0.91 angstrom into sine of 90 degree minus psi by 2. Psi is 50 degree at which you are seeing the peak. So this is 25 angstrom, or cos of 65 if you wish. This will come out to be 1.65 angstrom. Okay. So this is the wavelength of the de Broglie wave, or wavelength of the wave which is causing the interference. So this is the wavelength of the diffraction or interference. Now what is the de Broglie wavelength of the wave? So let me call that also lambda d, and that I can calculate because I know this is the momentum. So the de Broglie wavelength will be h by the momentum of the electron, which is h by root over of 2 me eV. If you put in the numbers, you will get this to be 1.67 angstrom. That's a very good match. So Davison-Germer's observation of these peaks around 50 degree for 54 volt of electron energy could be directly explained using de Broglie hypothesis. And that showed that the hypothesis is actually true. There exists a matter wave associated with the electrons. As I said, G.P. Thomson in 1927 used another type of diffraction method, which is called G.P. Thomson 1927 also showed existence of matter waves for electron. And this let us finally conclude that matter also has wave properties. You see, earlier we saw with Einstein's photoquanta hypothesis that what was known to be a wave, electromagnetic wave, has matter properties, and now the matter has wave properties. And these two, with, if you believe in Bohr, it essentially is telling you that everything that you see in nature must have these dual properties. Depending on what experiment you are doing, one of these properties will be you have to use one of these properties to explain the outcome of these experiments. So now the rest of our discussion in the course of quantum mechanics will be based on these matter waves, and we are going to learn rather how the electron behaves as when it has to be treated as waves. So let us look at, or let us recapitulate about our understanding of waves a little bit. First wave we encountered is electromagnetic wave, and we said that we discussed about it in our discussion on special relativity, the first lecture on special relativity, and it has a wave equation 1 by c square, and let me write it as psi, which is the quantity which is oscillating, and we still do not know for the matter waves, the waves of electrons, what is the quantity which is oscillating. So keep that in mind. We saw that this is what is the equation of the wave, and for any wave I can write, so any wave psi can be a function of many different spatial variables. We will be using mostly one of the spatial variables here for our discussion in almost the entire course. So this will be a function which depends on kx minus omega t. So this any wave is actually, it depends on some k times x minus some omega times t. Okay, one particular case example, one particular example we saw, that which is essentially what we have in our back of our mind, if we call it a wave, sine of kx minus omega t. Okay. Now for electromagnetic waves, omega and k are related. Omega is given by ck, which comes directly from this equation. And this, we, if you remember, we call it dispersion relation. Also remember that, so this we can, you can set this y into this equation, sorry, this psi into this equation, and you will see the k and omega, which I have written here, are related by omega equals ck. Easy to see for the sine case. Okay, and if you remember, k is given by 2 pi by lambda and omega is 2 pi times nu. Alright, let us look at matter waves. This was electromagnetic waves. Let us look at matter waves. We still do not know what it is a wave of. But as we said, any wave, just like any wave, so this also should be like this, with an example can be. So I still do not know whether this will be an example, but it can be like this. Okay. What else do we know? We know that energy of the matter wave is given by h cross omega, or the frequency of the wave is given by E by h cross, and the momentum is given by P by h by lambda, or if I write h by 2 pi, and I have to multiply here with 2 pi, so P is essentially k times h cross. Okay, fine. So I'm not putting the suffix d over here anymore, because all that we are talking about now are mostly we'll be talking about matter waves from short while from now. Now let's ask the question, how is it that we got this dispersion relation for the electromagnetic wave? Well, we put this back into our equation of wave, and then so what happens is that it's a second derivative in time. When I take the first derivative, one omega comes out, minus omega, because it's a sine, so sine becomes cos. 1 minus omega comes out. When I take the second derivative, another minus omega comes out. As I said, take second derivative with time, and cos again becomes sine. So it is this time derivative. Each time derivative is giving me 1 omega. Similarly, each x derivative will give me 1 k. And that's how, because it has two space derivative and two time derivative, I will get omega square equals c square k square, and from that I get omega equals ck. Here we kind of know what is the dispersion relation. So let us see that if we know the dispersion relation. We still do not know what is the wave of, but we are trying to guess the dispersion relation for a free electron. That is an electron which is not seen, which has not seen any potential. Well, let's talk about non-relativistic cases for the time being, because this is only understanding part is going on. So we know that the energy and momentum is related this way. So the easy thing will be to write the energy in terms of omega and also momentum in terms of omega, and that is my dispersion relation. That mass is the electron mass, and drop that suffix e. So that is my dispersion relation. So you see, to get 1 omega, we need one time derivative. If I do one time derivative in this, I will get 1 omega out. Here I have 2k. To get 2 k's, we need two special derivatives. So we can kind of guess. For the electrodynamics case, there was a way of arriving at that wave equation. In this case, we have to just guess because we still do not know even what the wave is of. So we say that, okay, so it will be like del psi del t in one side, and del 2 psi del x2 in the other side, and there can be some constant which doesn't depend on psi. So this constant cannot depend on x, t, k or omega. This constant in the previous case was just c squared, but that will not work here because I have only one time derivative. So you see, we said in generalities of this form. One example, we put a question mark here, is sine of kx minus omega t. Let's see if that will work. So let's assume we kind of have guessed that this will be our wave equation for a free electron. Now let us assume that psi of x and t is, this worked quite well for the electrodynamics case. So if I do del psi del t, this is now equals time derivative, I get minus omega out, and then I get psi 0 cos of kx minus omega t. And if I do del 2 psi del x2, what will I get? Del 2 psi del x2 will be, I will get, every time I do the derivative, I'll get 1k out, so finally I'll get 2k, k is out, so it will be k square. Sine will become cos first, and then cos will become sine with a minus sign. So this will be this. So if I put them back into my equation, what I will get is minus omega cos of kx minus omega t equals minus k square sine of kx minus omega t, and I forgot that I have to multiply the left hand side by alpha. There can be a constant here. There has to be a constant here. You see that this is like 1 by t dimension here. This is 1 by length square dimension, or sorry, not 1 by length square. Yeah, 1 by length square dimension here. So there has to be a constant which has certain dimension. So all right, this is what I need to have. And you remember that alpha cannot be a function of k, x and omega or t. I'm sorry, so it cannot be a function of k and x. Obviously it can be a function of omega and t, because that is what we are trying to figure out. That will give me the dispersion relation. It cannot be a function of x or omega. But you see, it is a function of x and omega because I have cos over here and sine over here. So everything is a function of k square and x square. So you can forget about the minus sign. So this doesn't work. Doesn't work. Now I am not stating it as a proof, but I can show you now that if I have chosen psi x and t as rather psi 0 e to the I omega t minus kx, now this is a complex, it's a complex function, then let us see what will happen. So alpha del psi del t will be, I'll get I omega outside and then alpha, and del psi del t will give me I omega times psi back. So this is I omega psi, and this is equals to del 2 psi del x2, if that is my equation. Then what do I get? So two derivatives with respect to x will give me minus ik 2 times and then psi. Now if I compare these two, what do I see? I see first of all psi goes out of the window. I get I omega alpha times I omega equals minus k square. So if I choose alpha to be minus k square by I omega, that is, if I write my equation as I'm sorry. So let's go back one step. So this is what I get. Now let us compare this with what I wanted to get, which is this dispersion relation. So h cross times omega equals k square h cross by 2m. So if I now write here h cross times omega, I want it to be k square h cross square by 2m. Okay. See, for this you need alpha to be minus I 2m by h cross square. Sorry, 2m by h cross. If I put alpha to be I 2m by h cross, then I will get this dispersion relation. So this is what we have got, what we expected or what we want. So in this case, we already knew what dispersion relation we want from the energy and momentum relation and de Broglie hypothesis. What we did was we guessed a type of equation here, and then we said that okay, so psi can have this form e to the I omega t minus kx. Then if I choose alpha to be this, then I get back the dispersion relation. So this equation actually works then as a wave equation. For free electron. Free means not affected by any potential. Okay, so we'll have this equation as our bread and butter in the later part of the course, or a modified version of this equation. But we learned two things here. So one is that the good old wave equation does not work. So this equation does not work for us because it does not give me the right dispersion relation. We learned that this equation does work. We also learned that psi, which is a real function, will not work. It's not only this sine real function, any other real function will not work. We saw that a complex function will work, but a real function will not work because the coefficient of my equation has I in it. So if the coefficient has I, so when I write down this equation, let me write it down in this form, which is not very general, but this will suffice for our discussion now. If psi is a real number, so then this is real and this is real. These are real. M and H cross are all real. Real if psi is real. It does not work out because if psi is real, this part and this part are both real, but this is imaginary. So psi has to be psi for matter wave has to be complex. Okay, so we'll stop our discussion today, and now we will pick up about this matter wave. We'll first discuss a few four more properties of a wave, and then we'll ask the question that what is this matter wave, a wave of, and how can we actually predict things about this wave or things out of this wave. Thank you for your attention. That's it for today.